There is a specific kind of loneliness that has no name in most languages. It is not the loneliness of being single. That one has edges. You know where it starts. You know what would fix it. This is different. This is the loneliness of sitting in a warm house with dinner on the table and a man in the next room and feeling more alone than you have ever felt in your entire life. More alone than any empty apartment. More alone than any Friday night by yourself. Because, at least when you are alone, you are not also invisible. My name is Nadia. And for 9 years, I lived inside a marriage that looked, from the outside, like everything a woman could want. He was home every single night. Not once did he stay out late without calling. Not once did I wonder where he was. Not once. And I want to tell you, that is not always the comfort people think it is. I met Owen at a work conference when I was 28. He was in finance. I was in project management. He was the kind of man who remembered everything. What drink you ordered, what you mentioned in passing 6 weeks ago, the name of your childhood dog after one conversation. I thought that quality meant he was paying attention to me. I know now that it was something different. Owen collected facts the way some people collect stamps. He could tell you the exact day we met, the exact restaurant on our third date, the exact dress I wore to his sister's wedding. He had all the data. He just never had any of the warmth that was supposed to come with it. We were married 3 years after we met. I was 31. He was 34. The wedding was in October at a vineyard, and it rained lightly all afternoon, and I thought it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The first year was good, or I remember it as good. Looking back now, I think I was just too busy building a life to notice what was already missing. The second year, I noticed. Not in a dramatic way, just a low awareness, like a sound at the edge of hearing. I would try to tell Owen something that had happened, something funny, something strange, something that had gotten under my skin. And he would listen with his eyes on me, nodding, say something moments, and then something like, interesting, or, yeah, that's a lot. And then he would go back to whatever he was doing. I started noticing that he never asked a follow-up question, not once. I could tell him I'd had a difficult conversation with my manager, and he would say, tough day, and leave it there. He never asked what the conversation was about, what I thought, how it made me feel, what I was going to do. He heard me. He just never wondered about me. And there is an entire world of difference between those two things. By year 4, we had our son, Theo. He came in August in a heat wave, and I was enormous and exhausted and more in love with this small, furious person than I had thought possible. Owen was a present father in all the practical ways. He did night shifts without being asked. He built the crib himself, twice, because the first time he got the slats wrong. He coached Theo's football team from the time Theo was 6. He was at every parent's evening, every school play, every sports day. But here is the thing about a man who is good at the visible parts of parenting. It can become a kind of armor. You cannot criticize him. He's there, isn't he? He shows up, doesn't he? What more do you want? I started to feel like I was not allowed to want more, like wanting to be emotionally known by my own husband was an unreasonable request. Like I was asking for something extravagant, the way you might feel asking for dessert when the main course was perfectly adequate. I told myself, he's a good father. He's a good provider. He's faithful. He's home every night. Some women would give anything for what you have, Nadia. Stop making everything complicated. I told myself that for about 5 years. The thing that finally broke through my own rationalization was small, embarrassingly small, in a way. I had been shortlisted for a national award in my field. It was a big deal, 3 years of work, a project I had led from nothing, an outcome that had genuinely changed how our sector operated. My name was in the shortlist announcement sent to 3,000 people in my industry. I came home and I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, "Owen, I need to tell you something. I'm on the shortlist for the Henderson Award." He looked up. He said, "Oh, yeah? What's that?" I explained. He said, "That's great, Nadia. Good work." And then he asked if I'd thought about what we were doing for dinner. That was it. I sat in the bathroom for 20 minutes after that. Not crying. Exactly. Just sitting. Trying to understand why that moment had landed so hard when I should have been used to it by now. And I realized it landed hard because I had spent 3 years on that project. 3 years of late nights and early mornings and impossible decisions and moments I had wanted to tell him about and had learned not to bother. And the recognition of all of that, the Henderson shortlist, had just been acknowledged with good work and a question about dinner. He had no idea what that project had cost me because I had stopped telling him things, because I had learned slowly and quietly that telling him things did not lead anywhere. I had trained myself out of sharing my life with my own husband, and I hadn't even noticed I was doing it. Around this time, I started spending more time with my friend Rachel. She and I had known each other since university, but the friendship had gone through its quiet patches over the years, the way friendships do. Her marriage had ended 2 years earlier, not dramatically, just a slow unraveling that she had described to me at the time as like watching a plant die when you don't know which part of its care you've been getting wrong. I had understood that metaphor intellectually at the time. Now I understood it in my body. We started meeting for coffee every other Tuesday, and what struck me every single time was how much ground we covered in 90 minutes. She asked questions, real ones. She wanted to know what I actually thought, not just what happened. She would remember something I'd said the previous week and come back to it. "You mentioned you were nervous about the Henderson result. How are you feeling now it's out?" She noticed. She wondered. She followed the thread. I started looking forward to those Tuesdays more than anything else in my week. And one Tuesday in March, driving home from the cafe, I thought, I get more of myself back in 90 minutes with Rachel than I do in an entire week living with my husband. I pulled over on a quiet street and sat with that thought for a while. It was not comfortable. I want to tell you something about what happens to a person when they spend years not being wondered about. You start to stop wondering about yourself. I don't mean you stop caring about your life. I mean the internal voice that narrates your experience. It's the one that notices things and finds them interesting and wants to share them. Starts to go quiet. Because there is no point generating observations that will never find a home. The brain is efficient. It stops producing what is never used. By year 7, I had become a more muted version of myself. Friends from before the marriage would sometimes remark on it. My sister said once, carefully, "You used to be so loud about things you cared about. What happened to that?" I told her I'd just gotten more private. I didn't know yet that that wasn't the same thing. The woman I had been at 28 The one who would call her best friend at 11 at night to process something that had happened, who had strong opinions about everything and wanted to argue about them, who found the world relentlessly interesting and could not stop pointing at things and saying, "Look at that. Isn't that strange?" That woman had gone very quiet. She hadn't left. She was still there. I could feel her occasionally, in flashes, in conversations with Rachel, in moments alone with Theo when he said something that surprised me, in the project work that I was still doing even as I'd stopped telling Owen about it. But she was not welcome at home. Not because Owen was cruel. He wasn't. But because a person who is never wondered about eventually stops offering themselves to be wondered about. That is what 9 years of emotional absence does. The turning point did not come from inside me. I want to be clear about that, because I had been inside myself for years, and it had not been enough. The turning point came from Theo. He was 7. We were at Owen's parents' house for a Sunday lunch, his mother, his father, his sister, and her husband, the whole family around one long table, loud and warm in the way Owen's family always was on the surface. At some point, his mother asked Owen out, "So what's Nadia working on these days?" And Owen said, without hesitation, without looking at me, "She's been doing some project management stuff. Keeping busy. Some project management stuff. Keeping busy. 3 years. The Henderson shortlist. A project that had changed how an entire sector operated. And that was the summary he had been carrying. Some project management stuff." I did not say anything. I smiled and reached for my water glass. But Theo, 7 years old, sitting next to me, coloring on a piece of paper he'd asked his grandmother for, looked up at that moment and said, "Mom got an award, Nana. It was a really big deal," she told us at dinner. He said it so simply, so factually, the way children state things they believe everyone already knows. The table made the right noises. Owen said, "Yeah, that's right," and moved on. But I sat with what had just happened. My 7-year-old son had been paying more attention to my life than my husband had in years. Theo had held on to a dinner conversation, filed it away, retrieved it when it mattered. He had done, instinctively and without effort, the thing that Owen had never once done in 9 years. He had wondered about me. I excused myself to use the bathroom. I stood at the sink for a few minutes with the tap running. I had loved Owen. I was sure of that. I had loved the man I believed I was marrying. Curious, attentive, full of the capacity for real closeness. And somewhere in 9 years I had accepted, without ever consciously deciding to, that that man was not who I had actually married. I had married a man who was reliable, consistent, faithful, and fundamentally not interested in who I was on the inside. And it had taken a 7-year-old pointing at me at a Sunday lunch table for me to finally stop finding ways to explain that away. I tried. I want to be clear about that. That evening, after Theo was in bed, I told Owen I needed to talk to him. We sat at the kitchen table. I said, "I felt something today at your parents' house. When your mums asked what I was working on, and you said some project management stuff. I said, 'Do you know what I've been doing for the past 3 years?' He said, 'The Henderson thing.' I said, 'Do you know what the Henderson project actually was? What it did? Why it mattered?' A pause. Then you said it was about sector reform, something to do with procurement. I had told him in detail. Twice. Once when I got the brief, once when we made the shortlist. Both times he had nodded and said that sounds interesting. I said, You couldn't tell your mother one specific thing about it, he said. I'm not good at remembering the details of work stuff. I said, you know your colleague Marcus' quarterly targets. You told me about them last week for 15 minutes. Silence, I said. It's not about the project, Owen. It's that Theo, a 7-year-old, paid more attention to my life today than you have in years, he remembered. He thought it was worth saying out loud. And you didn't even know he knew, he said. I didn't realize Theo had been listening. I said, that's not the point. He said, I'm home every night, Nadia. I don't know what else you want from me. And that sentence, I'm home every night, landed exactly the way it had every time before. Like a door closing. Like the end of a conversation he believed was now resolved. I said, what is my closest friend's name? More silence. Then, Rachel. No, is it Rachel? It is, but he had to think about it. 3 years of Tuesday coffees, the friendship that had held me together, and he had to think about whether her name was Rachel. He wasn't a bad man. I want to keep saying that because it matters. He was not malicious. He had just never been curious about my interior life. Not in the deep way, not in the way that meant he held information about me because it mattered to him. He held it the way you hold a PIN number. Functionally, not lovingly. We tried therapy, 6 sessions. He engaged with it genuinely. The therapist said something in our 3rd session that I have thought about many times since. Owen, when Nadia tells you something about herself, what do you do with it? He said. I listen. The therapist said, and then? He thought for a long time. Then he said, I don't know what you mean by and then. That was the moment I understood that what I needed from a partner was something Owen genuinely did not know existed. Not because he was broken, just because it had never occurred to him that listening was only the beginning. I filed for divorce 14 months after that, Saturday morning in September. Owen was shocked, not devastated in the way I might have expected. Not broken, not angry. Shocked, the way you are when something that seemed fine turns out not to have been fine at all. He said, I thought things were getting better. I said, I know. That was the problem. Because the therapy had not closed the gap. It had just given me language for the gap. And language for a wound is not the same as healing it. Theo was 8. He handled it in the way children handle things, with more understanding than you expect and more difficulty than they show. He lives primarily with me. He spends every other weekend with Owen, who is still the same good father he always was. He coaches the football. He shows up. He just doesn't wonder. About 4 months after the separation, Theo and I were washing up after dinner, him drying, me washing, the way we'd fallen into on the nights it was just us. And out of nowhere, he said, Mom, do you know what your favorite color is? I said, Of course I do. It's green, dark green, like old bottles. He nodded very seriously and said, I told Dad that once, and he said he didn't think you had one. I kept washing the dish in my hands. I didn't say anything, Theo said. I think he just didn't know. 8 years old. I think he just didn't know. Not accusing, not taking sides, just stating a fact he had already made peace with, in the way children sometimes arrive at wisdom before adults have finished arguing about whether it's true. I said, I think you're right, love. He put the dry plate in the cupboard and said, I know loads of your favorite things. I said, like what? And he listed them, dark green, the smell after rain, that one bakery on the high street with the almond croissants, The way light comes through the kitchen window at about 4 in the afternoon in winter. Old films with no CGI. The sound of a really good thunderstorm. He knew. He had been paying attention his whole life, quietly collecting the things that made me myself because he loved me. And it mattered to him who I was as. I dried my hands and hugged him for a long time. That was not small. That was everything. The first winter alone was harder than I expected and easier than I feared. Harder because the house was quieter than I had prepared for, and because Theo, being gone every other weekend, left a silence that I had to learn to fill rather than manage. I was 40 years old, and I had to teach myself to spend a Saturday alone without organizing it into productivity. Easier because almost immediately, within weeks, I noticed that I had started talking again, not just to Rachel, but to everyone. I was louder in meetings. I started calling my sister in the evenings the way I used to. I started having opinions again, strong ones about small things and large ones. The way I had at 28 when I was too busy being interested in the whiz world to make myself smaller for anyone. One evening in January, I was on the phone with my mother and she laughed at something I said. One of those big, delighted laughs. And then she said, "God, I've missed you." I asked what she meant. She said, "You've been away for a while. It's nice to have you back." I did not tell her where I had been, but I knew. Here is what I want to leave you with. A man being home every night is not the same as a man being present. Faithfulness is not the same as intimacy. Showing up is not the same as seeing you. You are allowed to need to be wondered about. You are allowed to need a partner who is curious about your interior life, who holds information about you because they love you, not because they're good at remembering things. The loneliness of being unseen inside a marriage is real. It has a cost, and the fact that it leaves no visible marks does not mean it is not doing damage. I am not telling you what to do with that. I do not know your life. I know mine. I know that I spent 9 years making myself quieter. And I know that the first time someone who loved me said, "God, I've missed you," I understood exactly what had been lost and what was possible to find again. Leave me a comment if you have ever been told you have nothing to complain about and felt the sting of how wrong that was. I read them all, and if you want to hear about the moment Theo asked me why I seemed different and what I told him, that story is next. I'll see you there.